I'm Janelle and welcome to my very first long form YouTube video. Today's video is all about these painted tile floors and how I made them look like marble. I'm going to break down all the steps for you in case you want to do the same. This is our floor tile to start with. Really nothing seriously wrong with it. They were 13 years old but still in really great shape. I had recently updated everything else in the bathroom though, and I just felt like the floors weren't really going as well with everything else anymore. They have a little bit of a yellow tinge to them, which I didn't love, but they were in good shape, so I didn't want to rip them out either. And this is what my newly painted floors look like. I really love how they go with everything else in the bathroom now. I just feel like everything works really well together. They're nice and bright, which I really like. I'm really happy that I could utilize what I already have. I didn't need to rip out my flooring, and I just feel like I gave these floors new life. And it's really what I would pick out today if I was to pick out tile floors. I even painted around our toilet. I'm just really happy with how this turned out. I'll show you now how I did it. I prepped the floors by giving them a really good wash with Tide and bleach. Then I gave the floors a really good scrub with Crud Cutter, especially the grout lines, to make sure that I was getting any built up dirt and grime off of there. Then I gave the floors a water rinse and a vacuum. They definitely hadn't been this clean in a while. I painted my floors with Rustoleum floor base coat. I let the first coat dry for 24 hours before applying the second coat, and I ended up needing 3 coats for good coverage. I let that dry for a full 24 hours before moving on to the next step. I needed 3 different paint mixtures to create my faux marble look. All 3 mixtures are varying ratios of paint, glaze, and water. This first one that I'm mixing up here is for the Scumble. I've got the amounts written there for you. This mixture here is the veining. I'll also include the brands of paint in the description below. This third mixture here is called the Overglaze. I like to write on the cups with Sharpie marker so that I don't get them mixed up. Clear plastic cups and spoons work awesome for mixing the paint up, and whatever I don't use, I just cover the cups with plastic wrap and a rubber band to keep it fresh. I learned this method from Amy Howard, who is an absolute guru when it comes to faux marble tile. I learned so much from her videos. She has so many helpful tips, and I'll link one of her videos in the description below. I would have followed her method to a T, but the marbling she was doing in her videos was a little bit darker than the look I wanted. And also she happens to use her own brand of paint, which I'm sure is awesome, but I really wanted to use what I had on hand at home, so I took her method and tweaked it. I did have to do some experimenting to come up with these ratios. These here are the last few tiles I have to paint. I've got 2 full tiles there and then 3 little half tiles. So I'll show you how I do the veining technique. I always start off by vacuuming the tile because you would be surprised how many hairs will show up in your paint once you get painting. Then I tape off each tile individually, making sure that the tiles aren't touching each other. I'm ready for step 1 of the veining process, which is called the Scumble. I've got my Scumble mixture here ready to go. I'm working in sections, so I will apply my Scumble to these tiles that I just taped off, and then I'll let that dry and I'll be ready to move on to the next step of the veining process. I'm applying my Scumble with a seawall sponge, and then I'll let it dry for about a minute or so before I come back in with a lint-free rag. And the lint-free rag just helps to soften and blend the marks from the sponge, just so that it's not so obvious that we used a sponge to apply the paint. This is a very, very light color. That's the look I was going for though, was the white Carrara marble. I tried to skip this step and it doesn't look as natural with just a stark white tile. Here you can see a little bit better the marks that the Scumble leaves on the tile. The Scumble is just a tad darker than the white Grout. These tiles here all have the Scumble applied to them. I'm gonna let that dry for about half an hour before I move on to the next step, which is the veining. Before I really get into the veining here, I'm just going to show you why a feather is used. And okay, this is like an ideal feather, but the very tip of it broke off, and so it doesn't work as well anymore. This tiny little feather is all I have left right now. I'll show you the basic idea of using a feather is that sometimes you use it like just to come to a point, but then sometimes you set it right down and you can drag it. And it's the combination of those two things that make it look like real marbling. So coming to a point and barely putting any paint, and then laying it down, and then you can kind of drag it too. So that's why a feather works so well for that. I look for any areas that don't look very realistic, and then I take a dry brush, and you can use your dry brush to kind of set down the paint. And see this area here, this curve looks a little too perfect, so I'm gonna push some of the paint just so that it doesn't look so perfect. I just use my dry brush to kind of work the paint. If an area is set up that doesn't look natural, sometimes there's a way to kind of fix it by adding a little more paint sometimes too. I ended up buying a package of 10 tiles from Home Depot that I would set beside the tile while I was painting, and I just found it very helpful so that I was able to mimic a marble pattern in the exact scale as well. I made sure that I was mixing up the patterns of tiles that I was using so that I wasn't doing the same pattern over and over again, and then I'll be able to return these tiles when I'm done. I'll do the dark veining first. That's always what I start off with, is like the outline, and then I'll fill it in afterwards. I use the feather to add paint, and then my dry brush is used to remove any excess paint, soften lines, and sometimes to push paint around. I wipe the paint that I pick up with my dry brush onto a rag just to make sure it stays dry. Working in small sections is key. I paint on a little bit with my feather and then stop and tweak it with my dry brush. This ensures that the paint isn't setting up before I have time to make any manipulations with the dry brush that I need to. Got my basic outline now of the vein, and now if you notice, this part here is a little bit darker than the white on the outside, so I'm going to paint the inside of this vein now. I just want to add a tiny bit of color there, so I'm just going to pick up a little bit of my vein paint on my brush, and again, even that's probably a little too much paint, so I'll wipe a little bit off on my rag. I don't want much color here, just to kind of almost so it looks like a shadow. Okay, I like how this is starting to look, and then if you notice there's some really dark veining in there, so I'm just going to come back now and add a little bit more details in. This vein has set up for about half an hour, and that's important, especially for these darker parts. You just want to make sure that it's dry before you do this last step, which is the overglaze. And for the overglaze, I'm just taking a little bit on the sponge again. You could add as much or as little as you want, and you don't have to cover the whole thing either if you don't want. So that's dried for about 30 seconds or so, and now I'm just dabbing it off with my dry rag. If you find that your rag's getting wet, just fold it and find a dry patch again of your rag. And I'm just kind of randomly working. So sometimes I end up deciding that I'm gonna let that dry, and then I can always come back if I want it to look even a little bit softer than that or a little more subtle. I can let this dry and then come back with another coat of overglaze. Once I got done the marbling and pulled the tape off, I noticed that on a few tiles, some of the paint from the marbling had bled onto the grout lines. So I took my base coat with a small paintbrush and touched those areas up and then let that dry before going in with my clear coat. I decided to do 2 coats of the clear coat. After spending all that time doing the faux marble effect, I really want these floors to last. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to have plenty more home DIY decor content to come. So if you enjoyed today's video, I'd really appreciate you pushing the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.